Dragon Ball. The biggest anime in the entire world is taking it by storm once again, as it wraps up the Dragon Ball Super series, and in the world of video games, people go crazy over the character creation of Xenoverse or the insane fighting game mechanics in FighterZ. But Dragon Ball wasn't always as big as it is today, and games-wise, it had very humble beginnings. My name's Globku, and this is the complete history and evolution of Dragon Ball games. We start by looking at the first Dragon Ball games ever created. Most of them only came out in Japan, so I'll be translating some of the titles myself, making it easier for you to follow along our complete history. Sit back and enjoy the ride. February 1986. Japanese TVs received the first images of Dragon Ball. A little child with a tail, who was surprisingly strong, lived at his grandfather's house and looked over his treasure, the 4-star Dragon Ball. 7 months later, the first Dragon Ball game was made. Dragon Ball Great Exploration came out on the Super Cassette Vision, a console from the same generation as the NES. This was the first time Goku was in a video game, and this was the only game developed or published by someone who was not Bandai or Bandai Namco. It was made by Epoch, the same company that manufactured the console, but unfortunately for them, the NES was taking the world by storm. These simplistic games were not doing it for gamers anymore. The simplistic controller was no longer enough. The NES had figured out what we wanted, so this console ended up being forgotten as everyone got an NES. But this game, made by Epoch on an Epoch console, was and will always be the first Dragon Ball game ever made. It didn't take long for Bandai to pick up the license and start putting out games on the most popular console at the time. Only 2 months after Great Exploration came the first Dragon Ball game on the NES. Dragon Ball Shenron's Riddle. This was an action RPG that came out on the same year as a little game called The Legend of Zelda. Similar to Zelda, this was also an RPG where you would explore levels to get items such as power-ups or the power pole, but unlike Zelda, it was more of a linear game and less of an open world. And on boss fights, the game would actually switch to a side-scroller. In Europe, the game was translated to French, but in America, the game changed drastically. It came out as Dragon Power, featuring this beautiful cover art. You may notice that with the exception of the dragon, there's not a lot of Dragon Ball in this cover, and that's because in America, this wasn't even a Dragon Ball game. At this point, Dragon Ball had only come out in Japan, so there was no reason to license that property in the US. So what America did was take the Japanese game and base it upon the novels that Dragon Ball itself is based on. If you didn't know, Dragon Ball itself is loosely based upon a Chinese classic novel, The Journey to the West. Journey to the West is public domain, which means no one needs to pay licensing fees to use characters or take inspiration from its narrative, which is why you see so many Monkey King or Sun Wukong characters in other video games, like League of Legends, Dota, Warframe, or even Overwatch, which has a Wukong skin for Winston. Dragon Power is essentially the same game as Shenron's Riddle, but they replaced Goku's sprite with a monkey and changed the names of a lot of characters and moves. For instance, the Kamehameha is called the Wind Wave, and the Dragon Balls are referred to as the Crystal Balls. After that, we would have to wait 2 years before another Dragon Ball game was released, as Bandai started working on something quite different. A new style of game that would define Dragon Ball games for over 5 years, with a total of 7 games released within that style for the NES. This is what we call the Goku-Den series. It started as a text adventure with Dragon Ball The Demon King's Revival. You've got a few options on what to do. You arrive at the Kame house, you search different parts of the house, you find the Dragon Radar, you find Krillin's dead body, you know, Dragon Ball things. And then you leave the house and find out that exploration and combat both use randomly generated cards, which ended up defining the Goku-Den series. Each card has a Dragon Ball, an effect, and a number, and depending on the Dragon Ball, your card will win or lose the duel against your opponent's card. If it wins, you trigger the effect, and the number usually represents how strong that effect will be. And that's pretty much how combat works in all of the games from this series. For movement and exploration, you would move in this board-like map to reach your destination, and once again, you move using the cards. 1 year later, they released Dragon Ball 3 Goku's Story. Why the number 3? Because it's the third game on the NES. That's it. That's the only reason. It didn't need to be related to the previous games. In fact, it's definitely not related to Shenron's Riddle, but it is called Dragon Ball 3, and we just need to accept it. The text adventure parts were dropped from this game and replaced with cutscenes, but the random card element for exploration and combat were both kept. The board-like map now had more options on where you could go from the very start, making it seem a bit more open-ended, but the game remained largely the same. And this would be the last Dragon Ball game for a very long time, because from here, we have entered the Dragon Ball Z era. Having found a formula for making Dragon Ball games and with literally no competition or reason to change their methods, Bandai kept putting out games from the Goku-Den series, but transitioned from the original Dragon Ball to Dragon Ball Z. With this transition, they dropped the board-like map and replaced it with more open sections that players could explore at will. Theoretically, it worked very similar, you still use the cards, but now it doesn't look like a board game anymore. It's starting to look a bit more like a proper map. The combat system received some animations as well, making fights look a bit more flashier, even if those animations were way too long and boring to watch over and over. That's what Dragon Ball Z was all about, flashy animations and never-ending battles. The first Dragon Ball Z covered the Saiyan saga with fights against Raditz, Nappa and Vegeta. They even added a few movie and filler characters like Pumpkin. Remember Pumpkin? Yeah, me neither. The second game covers the Frieza saga, but for some reason Tien, Yamcha and Chiaotzu are not dead and they come along for the ride on the spaceship with Gohan and Krillin towards Namek. And the third game starts with Super Saiyan Goku defeating Frieza and mostly covers the Android saga. It ends in the battle of Piccolo against Imperfect Cell, so it doesn't really wrap things up on that whole arc. From here, the series got a little weird. For the first time, a game featured a fully original story. Dragon Ball's side story planned to eradicate the Saiyans, retained the gameplay elements from these previous games, but told a new story, which in its own way sprouted its own video game series and even an original video animation with the same name. And that's why the name of this game might be familiar to you. The game, the OVA, it was all built and released around the same time. But at this point, it was time to move on. The Super Nintendo was out. People were embracing this new generation of consoles, so Bandai needed to put some Dragon Ball games out on this next generation. But not before they released a really weird device and a Dragon Ball game to go along with it. The Bandai Daitouch was an accessory for the NES that came packaged with a game, Dragon Ball Z Gekito Tenkaichi Budokai. Words that might be familiar to you because of the PlayStation 2 games, but we're definitely not talking about the same games. The Daitouch was able to read physical cards that you would buy at a game store. After you scan one of those cards, the game would read the barcode and select a character for you in-game. Characters had different health points, energy, attack power, which made the game extremely unbalanced, as the difference between characters was sometimes abysmal, which also made this the first pay-to-win Dragon Ball game. Or, if you want to have a more positive outlook, this was Bandai's amiibo way before its time. Call them visionaries or greedy scumbags, but for all intents and purposes, this was actually the first Dragon Ball fighting game ever made. And as for the Daitouch, it was discontinued with only 7 games officially supporting it in its lifetime. After 6 games of the Goku-Den series on the NES, it was time to move on to the next console. Bandai released their first game on the SNES, picking this series back up with Super Saiyan Legend. This would be the last game in the Goku-Den series. It was essentially a remake of the first 2 Dragon Ball Z games, taking you from the Saiyan saga all the way to the end of the Namek saga. This would not only be the last Goku-Den game, but also the last Dragon Ball RPG for a while, as Bandai was trying out a new genre, fighting games. Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden started out a new series on the Super Nintendo, a series that would become so popular that it would transition to next generation consoles down the road, with a total of 9 games released up to date. It started simple, with a total of 13 playable characters, and each character had unique special moves and super moves. Characters could fly up in the air, as the screen would become split when characters distanced themselves too much. And despite its slow pace and floaty controls, it became the best-selling Dragon Ball game up to this point, thus cementing the future of this franchise in the fighting game genre. Super Butoden 2 added some features like the ability to charge your ki in the middle of battle, and its story mode ended up becoming very popular because it had many variations. Winning or losing a battle would alter the course of the story, which means players could spend a lot of time discovering the different outcomes. And Super Butoden 3 gave us characters from the Buu saga. It added a tournament mode, but this mode actually replaced the story mode, which wasn't a very popular decision. Still, with a refreshed roster of characters and the improvements to gameplay, the series kept evolving. Even Nintendo's rival console got a Butoden game, with the Dragon Ball Z Call of Destiny, which came out on the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. A game very similar to the Super Butoden games, with a different story for each playable character, again encouraging replayability in addition to just playing the game with your friends. And this game closed the Butoden series for this generation, but its popularity would carry it over to the next one in the future. Dragon Ball fighting games were just getting started, and the Butoden series was far from over. Having established those Dragon Ball fighting games, Bandai looked to diversify its portfolio and spread out across other platforms. First, trying it out on their own console, the Bandai Playdia. If you remember the last NES game of the Goku-Den series, it was the first Dragon Ball game that told an original story at that point. The plan to eradicate the Saiyans. That story gave birth to 2 original animations with the same name, which would be remastered more than 10 years later to the movie that most of you probably know nowadays, Dragon Ball: Plan to Eradicate the Super Saiyans. The original OVA was broken into 2 parts, one on the Earth and another one on an alien planet, and Bandai's Playdia got a game for each one of those parts. Both of these games were very simple, as the console itself was sold more of a multimedia center, not so much as a gaming console, so a lot of the games released over there were educational titles. And these Dragon Ball games followed that format. You would select a few dialogue options, locations, you would guide the story along by choosing the correct options. So the game itself wasn't impressive, but it did spawn a new movie and a new villain, so its impact was definitely huge in the universe of Dragon Ball. But that wasn't the only experiment. Bandai also released a very different game over on the TurboGrafx. Son Goku Legend was a mix of a fighting game with a turn-based battle. You didn't have full control over your character. Instead, you used one button to put your character on the offensive and another button to put your character on the defensive. You would choose a stance that would boost the damage you deal or the damage you take. And if you win this action phase, you then get to attack your opponent during the damage phase, which is when all the special moves happen. A very weird concept that didn't play very well, but the game looked really good at the time. It was probably the best looking Dragon Ball game so far. But leaving that weird experiment aside, Bandai went back to familiar ground, returning Dragon Ball to the RPG genre with the rise of the original Game Boy. Bandai wanted to bring the franchise to the rising phenomenon in the handheld console world. Dragon Ball fighting games were more popular, but RPGs were so much easier to develop on something as limited as the original Game Boy. So they created a new RPG series which got 2 games on this console, the Goku RPG. And Bandai wasn't just throwing RPGs to the side on the handheld consoles, or at least that wasn't the case yet. They stuck with the genre on the Super Nintendo, expanding their Goku-Den series, taking it to the next level. So they started what ended up being a short-lived series called Super Goku-Den. The combat was completely changed, the card system was completely scrapped off the game, they gave the players dialogue options to keep them engaged as the story progresses. The changes made were so significant that there was practically no trace of the previous Goku-Den games. Unfortunately, these were the only 2 games that came out in that series. It vanished right after that because fans had decided what they wanted, and what they wanted was more fighting games. And so with the arrival of a new generation of consoles, the Butoden series kept evolving. The Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn happily received some Dragon Ball games. PlayStation was up first, and it started off on the wrong foot with Dragon Ball Z Ultimate Battle 22. As far as mechanics went, this game wasn't too different from the original Super Butoden games. But the fighting game genre had evolved at this point, and Ultimate Battle 22 looked as if it stayed still in time, making it a really bad fighting game. There was no evolution from the previous Super Butoden games. In fact, you could argue that some areas of the game actually looked worse than previously, like the backgrounds in which the fights took place. A short time afterwards, it was Sega Saturn's turn to get a Dragon Ball game, Dragon Ball Z Shin Butoden, and everyone could see that despite the game having a different name, this was basically the same game as Ultimate Battle 22. The character select screen was exactly the same, they recycled the sprites from the PlayStation game, so the main difference with this one is that it only came out in Japan. Dragon Ball Z Hyper Dimension closed the Butoden series on the SNES. They made significant changes to the combat system that would not carry over to the rest of the games because at this point the world was moving on to newer consoles, leaving the Super Nintendo behind. But it was the first game in the franchise to have Kid Buu as a playable character. He still made it to the Super Nintendo. But everyone was looking at the Saturn and most of all looking at the PlayStation at this point. And these 2 consoles only had one game in common. That is, if you don't count Ultimate Battle and Shin Butoden, of course. And that game was unfortunately another failed experiment. It wasn't a part of the Butoden series, but it seemed to take some inspiration from the TurboGrafx game, Dragon Ball Z The Legend. The playstyle sure was unique. You had 2D sprites in a 3D environment, and you basically had to beat your opponent so much that the bar at the bottom would go in your favor, at which point you would unleash a meteor attack. Flying in the 3D space in a Dragon Ball game was something novel, but the game did end up being a little bit repetitive. Although it's worth noting that this was the first game to feature all the major Dragon Ball Z sagas, which made it very popular. It also included a few Easter eggs. For instance, if you let Frieza kill Krillin, Goku turns Super Saiyan. The game had really nice fan service, despite the poor gameplay. But the game that really blew up on this generation of consoles was, of course, Dragon Ball GT Final Bout. Dragon Ball Z had just premiered with its English dub in America, so there was a huge new audience jumping into Dragon Ball, and GT itself was wrapping up in Japan. But even if the people on the West weren't watching GT, they knew about it. And this game had some amazing graphics at the time. It was the first full 3D Dragon Ball game, and it had all the moves that you wanted. Ki Blast, the Kamehameha, the Final Flash. It lets you fly over the air. It lets you play as a Super Saiyan 4. So even if the game was completely broken in spots, a lot of fans still have fond memories of Final Bout because it allowed them to live that fantasy back when they were kids. It was the big breakthrough for Dragon Ball games on the PlayStation, the console that everyone had. But those weren't the only reasons why the game was so popular. We would not see another Dragon Ball game for another 5 years. So this was the most recent Dragon Ball game for a really long time. And if you think about it, it makes sense. After all, Dragon Ball GT was over. There was no more Dragon Ball on TV, and just like every other anime, once the show is over, the hype dies down and the video games stop. Except somehow, that wasn't the case with Dragon Ball, and it would take Bandai 5 years to realize that the hype was not dead. 5 years. 5 years of no Dragon Ball games. Honestly, I don't know how we made it. Gaming did not stop, Dragon Ball games did, so we moved forward the generation of consoles. 2 generations even, if we're talking about the handheld consoles. From the Game Boy, we moved past the Game Boy Color, and now people were playing around with the Game Boy Advance. And that's how Dragon Ball games would make a return. Partnering up with Atari, at the time Infogrames, who had more experience publishing games in the West, Dragon Ball games would shift dramatically, starting with Legacy of Goku. This was actually the first Dragon Ball game developed by an American company, Webfoot Technologies. And it was bad. An action-adventure RPG where you control Goku and play through the Saiyan and Namek sagas. Oh, and also the Snakes in the Forest saga. But for as bad as the game was, it started something new. A series that is still amongst the favorites of all time for Dragon Ball fans. It was a huge success, selling more than 1 million copies in the US. So Atari made a sequel, and it improved a lot. Legacy of Goku 2 was way better. And it's probably the main reason why the Legacy of Goku series is so popular even nowadays. Gameplay was sharpened, it looked a lot better than the first one. You played as multiple characters, which helped the appeal of reliving this story through the eyes of different protagonists. You could transform, use different abilities which were unlocked at a reasonable pace, making you want to keep going so you can unlock the next thing. There was an overworld, so you had this sense of freedom and exploration. And from the success of Legacy of Goku 2, it only seemed obvious that they had to make the third one. Even though it had a different name, that game was Boo's Fury. Here you could find everything that you had on the second Legacy of Goku game, with a small exception, challenge. This game was made a little too easy for most critics, a little too casual, but even so, it was a fun experience. The Legacy of Goku series remains to this day as the most popular series on the Game Boy Advance, and this gave Atari a reason to keep their partnership with Bandai and continue releasing games on the Game Boy Advance. At the same time as the first Legacy of Goku, a very different style of game was coming out. Dragon Ball Z collectible card game. It's exactly what it sounds like. You've got attacking phases, defending phases, during which you play cards as attacks or special moves. In fact, there was a real-life Dragon Ball trading card game, and the Game Boy Advance version uses those exact same rules. Roughly at the same time, they released another card game on the Game Boy Color. They shared some similarities, but it wasn't exactly the same. This one even had a few RPG mechanics in the mix. It wasn't all RPGs and card games though. If there was something that players had already made very clear, it was that they wanted Dragon Ball fighting games. So yes, even on the Game Boy Advance, we had some pure fighters. First up was Dragon Ball Taiketsu. Hey, I said pure fighters, I didn't say they were any good. Made by the same developer that brought us Legacy of Goku came Taiketsu, which is still considered to be one of the worst Dragon Ball Z fighting games ever. Another developer also tried their hand at the Game Boy Advance game. You might have heard of them, Arc System Works, and they brought Super Sonic Warriors, a different style of fighting game, very weird at first, but incredibly well received. You were so mobile, flying across the entire screen. The game was fast, the way Dragon Ball was supposed to be, and story mode took an interesting approach. A series of what-if scenarios. What if Vegeta was the one who turned Super Saiyan against Frieza? What if he was the hero? And all of this made fans fall in love with it, so much so that its sequel that came out the following year was the first Dragon Ball game on the Nintendo DS. The game became a tag team style of fighter where you could choose a team of 3 characters to fight against an enemy or another team. Again, sound familiar? However, the reception of this game was a bit mixed, so this is where the series ended. But Bandai would find this new partnership with Arc System Works extremely valuable in the future. So, to recap, on the Game Boy Advance we had RPGs, we had card games, we had fighters, but that wasn't everything. They also tried their hand at side-scroller beat-em-up type games, and that's how my personal favorite Dragon Ball game on the Game Boy Advance came to be. Advanced Adventure, developed by someone you might also be familiar with, developer Dimps. It followed the story of original Dragon Ball. The controls were so smooth. It played very well. The game was challenging enough to keep you on your toes. You had mini-games throughout the story to keep gameplay fresh, and even boss fights. Sure, the one-on-one game mode might be a bit straightforward and not the best fighting game of the group, but it was competent and made that game a more complete package. And hey, since Dimps could make a side-scroller beat 'em up, Webfoot Technologies decided to do the same with a Dragon Ball GT game, Transformations. And they completely ruined it. They even had a sequel planned and announced, but that ended up being cancelled. And with that, between 2002 and 2005, Dragon Ball games were a big deal on the Game Boy Advance. In parallel, during that same time period, they were an even bigger deal on the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube. Enter Dragon Ball Z Budokai. To this day, the Budokai series is one of the most beloved in the entire history of Dragon Ball games. Once again, developed by Dimps, Budokai took the world by storm, despite critics giving the game mixed reviews. It became the best-selling Dragon Ball game to date. It was Dragon Ball in the new generation of consoles. You played with 3D models on a 2.5D plane. Characters could be customized to include moves, buffs, transformations, meaning you could customize your favorite Dragon Ball characters, according to your own playstyle, or simply with what you thought was cool at the time. Story mode featured cinematic cutscenes, making the action feel that much more epic. Budokai 2 significantly improved the visuals, landing some better Metacritic scores. Gameplay was polished, the roster expanded, story mode changed quite a bit, which didn't please everyone. The first chapters of story mode gave you a game board representing a saga, which you would clear to move on to the next board, which was the next saga. It introduced fusions, which would also be available from customizing your characters, and all of that led to the pinnacle of the series, Budokai 3, which unfortunately did not come out for the GameCube. It was a PlayStation 2 exclusive. Using the previous games as a basis, the fighting system was completely revamped, and most of it, if not all of the changes, were for the better. Beam clashes, a fatigue meter, the transformation system was changed, and all of these tweaks resulted in happier critics and happier fans. Story mode went back to telling the original story, but allowed you to select the character you wanted to play as. So if you wanted to play through Yamcha's story mode, a lot of it was just reading, hey, this happened and Yamcha wasn't there, so I guess you don't get to play. Moving on. That was kind of funny, but also made story mode worth playing through with all the characters. And for the longest time, Budokai 3 was my personal favorite Dragon Ball game, and the feeling is universal. Those who played it share very fond memories of times spent battling in story mode, unlocking new abilities and characters, or simply playing against their friends. Budokai 1 and 3 were both remade in 2012 for the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 in an HD collection, a testament to their success and how well they held up with time. With Bandai successfully establishing a new series on the PlayStation 2 with Budokai, Atari wanted to take advantage of this partnership and make a game of their own, also on the PlayStation 2. So seeking out a new developer, Avalanche Studios, who at the time were owned by Disney, they made Dragon Ball Z Sagas. And they didn't just put it out on the PlayStation 2, but also on the GameCube and the original Xbox, making this the first Dragon Ball Z game to be released on a non-Japanese console, the first Xbox Dragon Ball game. Sadly, it wasn't a great game. They tried to take Dragon Ball in a new direction, giving you a level-based structure with collectibles and abilities to unlock as you play. It even gave you different characters to play as, but it wasn't fun or functional. It was a hassle to play. You fought the controls all the time, and the level design was also not so great. And perhaps because of that, this would not only be the first Dragon Ball game on the original Xbox, but also the last one. And then Dragon Ball got weird. But from that weirdness, a new series was born, a series that persisted all the way up to the 3DS. As Budokai ended its era on the PlayStation 2, Bandai was getting more adventurous with their Dragon Ball license and started partnering up with developers and publishers who specialized on something called TV games. These were essentially minigame consoles. You would buy the system and the game already came included with it. All you had to do was plug it into the TV. And it started with something from Handheld Games and Jack Specific called, well, Dragon Ball Z TV game. Doesn't get more descriptive than that. This Shenron joystick was also the console itself, and it came with 3 Dragon Ball Z games, or rather 3 game modes. It's hard to call each one of these an actual game. First we had Pong, but each character can throw fireballs. Then we had a very basic version of Butoden, and finally a pinball game that was surprisingly good. And from there, Bandai started publishing these types of games more often by partnering up with another developer, Let's Play TV, who released a total of 4 games in a series called Battle Tycoon Kamehameha. The game consoles came with something they called the Dragon Band, a couple of Velcro bands that you would wrap around your fingers, and these are basically your controllers. After wrapping them around your fingers, you use them to control your character in game. Using motion, you can throw punches, blocks, and throw fireballs, even do Kamehameha motions. And you play a set of levels on rails that you need to clear one after the other. This series had a total of 4 games with the same basic premise. The second game added characters and more minigames, the third game added a scouter to the accessories, and the fourth game was a crossover between Dragon Ball and One Piece, and used characters from both series. Pretty weird, right? Why am I even talking about these games? Compared to what we're getting on the PlayStation 2, they were already outdated. Well, while these games ended up going nowhere, our next series, which you would probably call just as weird as this one, actually sprouted something that is beloved by a subsection of this community to this day. What would later become the Dragon Ball Heroes series started off as Data Carddass. Having wrapped up development of Budokai 3, developer Dimps moved on to arcade games using collectible cards. And these things were all over Japan, from shops to vending machines. First, you would buy a card pack. The cards would give you playable characters in the arcade machines, where you would play a series of different minigames using the same engine as Budokai did on the PlayStation 2. They looked really good for arcade games. And every year, Dimps released a brand new game with brand new card packs constantly flowing, and this went on for more than 5 years. By year 6, the series changed quite a bit, but it's too soon to talk about that. For now, just remember that from this arcade game exclusive to Japan, a new series would be born in the future. In 2005, Bandai formed a new partnership with a new developer, Spike, known nowadays as Spike Chunsoft, after the fusion back in 2012. And from this brand new partnership, a new series was born on the PlayStation 2, Budokai Tenkaichi.
Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi. Everything else was just training.
This new series would shift Dragon Ball from a 2.5D plane to full 3D stages, using a brand new engine for its combat. So why was it called Budokai again if it had nothing to do with the previous games? Well, actually in Japan, it wasn't called Budokai Tenkaichi at all. That was a move from Atari when publishing the game in the US. Since Budokai games had so many fans, Atari was hoping to bring some of those fans along for this new series. And it didn't stop at the title. A lot of the sound effects and music were recycled from the Budokai series in the US version, trying to establish this as the natural continuation of the Budokai series. But, misleading or not, there was a lot of new impressive stuff with Budokai Tenkaichi. The roster was bigger than ever before. It featured not only characters that we weren't used to play as, but also transformations and forms that had not been playable in previous Dragon Ball games. The amount of fan service was through the roof. The game was fast, as a Dragon Ball game should be. You would be dashing across the stage at all times. And even though the game had a lot of buttons and a lot of complex systems, it was really easy to get into once you figured out how to do combos and special attacks. This did make the game very hard to master because of all its complex systems. But on the surface, for the casual Dragon Ball fan, you could make the explosions happen if you wanted to. The game was a great success, so of course, they had to make another one. Budokai Tenkaichi 2 expanded the already crazy roster of the first game into an even bigger roster. It gave us more fan service, selling even more copies, releasing not only on the PlayStation 2, but also on the Wii as a launch title. Budokai Tenkaichi 2 became the best-selling Bandai Namco game of 2006. And then Budokai Tenkaichi 3 went absolutely nuts with the roster size, with a total of 161 characters. It sold about as much as the second game, but reviews were actually a lot less positive. Playing through the Dragon Ball story was getting really old at this point, and if you think about it, Dragon Ball games worked like this for a while now. They would reinvent the game, launching a new series, and then every year they would release the same game slightly updated, and critics were getting fed up. Nevertheless, with such a complete roster, it became a fan favorite, and to this day, it's still one of the community's favorite Dragon Ball games. Around the time of Budokai Tenkaichi 2, Super Dragon Ball Z also came out for the PlayStation 2, another 2.5D fighting game, very different from the previous Budokai games though. But you know what? It wasn't that bad. But unfortunately for the developer Craftsman Meister, Budokai Tenkaichi was already established as the next Dragon Ball game on the PlayStation 2. So that was the first and the last Dragon Ball game Craftsman Meister developed. However, this new partnership with Bandai Namco would have them develop other anime games over the coming years. As for the original Budokai series, it didn't just die to Budokai Tenkaichi, it found a new home on PlayStation's portable console, the PSP. Still developed by Dimps in parallel to their Data Carddass games, it started with Shin Budokai, which despite the change of platform, it held up really well. The future looked bright for the Budokai series in this new platform based on the quality of the game alone. It did have the obvious disadvantage, you could just sit down and play with a friend, unless they also had a PSP and a second copy of the game, but the game was good. Story mode was based on the Fusion Reborn movie, and they kept working on the battle system. It kept improving, but like most PSP games, the sales weren't that impressive. Nevertheless, Shin Budokai would receive a second game, but this one would make some choices that I really did not agree with. First of all, looking at the behind-the-shoulder camera of Budokai Tenkaichi and how popular those games were on the PS2, they changed the default camera for the fighting system to something very uncomfortable. Fortunately, it was something you could change in the options menu. But what you couldn't change was their attempt at revamping story mode. They gave us an overworld that you could fly around, and here you basically have to protect these different cities from getting destroyed by villains, and this was bad. Even though the story's plot was interesting, it was an original story set in the future Trunks timeline after the androids were dealt with, and Bobby D was starting to make moves to revive Majin Buu. This overworld definitely got in the way of me enjoying the game, something that reviews definitely criticized, and sales-wise, it was even more disappointing than the previous game. But Budokai wouldn't hit rock bottom until Dragon Ball Evolution. Yes, a game based on that horrible movie. Even the title is misspelled. Dragon Ball is a single word? Come on, guys. Budokai lost its gorgeous cel-shaded look in favor of facial scans and a more realistic style. The fighting system was Budokai, so it was competent, it was okay, but wrapped around the plot and characters from the movie that everyone hated, this game was doomed to fail from the start. Budokai did return to the PlayStation 2 eventually, about a year after Budokai Tenkaichi 3. The final Budokai game was Infinite World, which would also be the final Dragon Ball game on the PlayStation 2. A full-fledged Budokai game, a return to form with improvements all across the board. Story mode even had some interesting mini-games like running across Snakeway. You don't get to do this every day. But despite its quality, it was time to move on. A lot of people don't even remember Infinite World at this point because we have seen this time and time again. The big guns, the big investment was already on the next console. So at the time, this final Budokai game felt like a cheap thing to keep PlayStation 2 owners happy, while Bandai focused on the next generation, the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. But before we get to that, the Tenkaichi series would suffer the same fate as the Budokai series. It dropped from the PlayStation 2 to the PSP with Tenkaichi Tag Team. It was pretty much Tenkaichi, but both you and your teammate would fight against the enemy at the same time. Both characters would be on screen, and if the enemy had a teammate as well, they would all be on screen. So it was the Tenkaichi system, but with 4 characters fighting simultaneously. Obviously, this could get chaotic and confusing very fast, but it wasn't a bad game by any means. It was also the last game on the PSP, and it was not the worst way to close that chapter, especially given that it followed Dragon Ball Evolution, which, sheesh. Speaking of handheld consoles, this was also the prime time for Dragon Ball games on the Nintendo DS. We've already talked about Super Sonic Warriors 2, which was the first game on the platform, but it sure as hell wasn't the last. What followed it was Harukanaru Densetsu, which was a strike of nostalgia. If you remember the first Dragon Ball games ever made, they were RPGs that used cards in a turn-based battle system. They used game boards to move characters around, and those same cards as dice rolls. Harukanaru Densetsu was a return to that Goku-Den style of game. a style that had already failed previously, but now with better technology, it was worth revisiting. The game was a huge success in Japan. In the West though, not so much. So what followed was also an RPG, but instead of that slow pace, instead of the turn-based battles, it had an action-oriented playstyle, and it heavily relied on the DS's touch capabilities. Dragon Ball Origins was the first non-Dragon Ball Z game in a very long time. It was developed by Game Republic, a new developer in the Dragon Ball games universe. Using the touchscreen, you would move Goku and make him fight, solve puzzles, and play through parts of the original Dragon Ball story. And just opposite to the previous game, this one was a success in the West, but not so much in Japan. The sequel, Dragon Ball Origins 2, continued the story of the original Dragon Ball, added a few mechanics, and it was in general a step up from the previous game. But it sold a lot less, which made it hard to justify a third game in this style. The developer Game Republic wasn't done though. They shifted style and grabbed another classic Dragon Ball series that had been dead for almost 15 years, and that's the Butoden series. Ultimate Butoden had a lot of interesting mechanics. When performing combos, the game would slow down as the enemy pressed some defensive buttons. It could be countering, it could be dodging, so it created these intense moments where both players were reacting and counterattacking each other. And the game was well received too. And finally, before we say goodbye to the Nintendo DS, we have one last game to talk about. Dragon Ball Z Attack of the Saiyans by Monolith Soft, who you might know as the developer of the Xenoblade Chronicles series. So, as you might expect, this was a JRPG, a very traditional JRPG that had you play through the Piccolo Jr. saga up till the Dragon Ball Z Saiyan saga. And with that, we close the book on the Nintendo DS. On another Nintendo platform, the Wii, Dragon Ball was also breathing its last breath, with Dragon Ball Revenge of King Piccolo, the only Dragon Ball game exclusive to the Wii. This was a side-scroller beat-em-up focused once more on the story of the original Dragon Ball. It was like an enhanced version of the Game Boy Advance title Advanced Adventures, but utilizing the Wii's power, beautiful graphics, wonderful animation, platforming, boss fights. It was a pretty complete package, even though it ended up being received with mixed reviews. And having closed the book on the PSP, Nintendo DS, and the Wii, it's time to wrap up another platform, the arcades, which were largely exclusive to Japan. First, this was a turning point for the Data Carddass series, as they released Dragon Ball Heroes. The collectible card game series started introducing story arcs, which were very well received by the community as they showcased different versions of the characters we loved, like future Trunks achieving Super Saiyan 3. It continued exploring concepts, what-if scenarios, all with original animation. It gave us player avatars, something that was also extremely novel at the time. The game was so popular that it ended up on the 3DS, so rest assured, even though the game is done on the arcades, we're not done talking about it. Roughly at the same time, another arcade game was coming out, and it would stick around for years to come. Dragon Ball Zenkai Battle Royale, which recently received an update and was kind of revived simply as Zenkai Battle. The game itself uses a similar fighting system to Tenkaichi, but not only has a 2v2 game mode like Tenkaichi Tag Team had, it also has a Battle Royale mode with a 4-player free-for-all. With its big roster of characters, it quickly gained popularity, and it's still played to this day. So even though it was the last game on arcades so far at least, maybe it was the last because it came to stay. And while we've closed the book on a lot of platforms, new doors were also being opened. Finally, in 2010, almost 25 years into the history of Dragon Ball games, the PC was getting its own game, Dragon Ball Online. The premise was something out of this world, and it filled us with excitement. An open world RPG where you could create your own Dragon Ball character, explore the world, learn your favorite abilities, interact with your favorite characters. The end product was not so exciting though. It was the most bare bones MMORPG that you could imagine. It was like an alpha version of World of Warcraft with a Dragon Ball skin. The traditional MMO combat, the repetitive quest design, the empty world, all of that made it extremely mediocre, and the game ended up never leaving the Asian market. Despite before release, a lot of people were asking for it to be brought over. Those requests slowly died after the game came out. But let's get back to the big boys, talk about the biggest Dragon Ball games on the biggest platforms. The new console generation had just been released with the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, and with it came a bunch of new Dragon Ball games, though for the most part, this generation lacked a bit in innovation. Most of the games were mere evolutions of previous concepts, or completely new concepts that just weren't quite good enough. First up was Dimps, with Dragon Ball Z Burst Limit, and they made what Dimps was used to making at this point, an evolution of their Budokai series. This next generation took the graphics to the next level, so during matches, you had some really good looking cutscenes. You could equip items called drama pieces, which would trigger specific events during a match. It felt like a fun cinematic experience, and that's not even to mention the best loading screens in a Dragon Ball game ever made. The game was heavily criticized for lacking innovation. After all, it was basically another Budokai. But in general, it received positive reviews, so it might surprise you when I say that this was actually the last Budokai game. Dimps ended the series on a high note and was now focused on developing other projects. And the reins of this generation fell to another developer, Spike. The makers behind Tenkaichi also brought that series and revamped it to the new generation with Raging Blast and Raging Blast 2. Raging Blast was a big step for Bandai Namco in North America, at least business-wise. Previously, a lot of Dragon Ball games were published with the help of Atari, who actually held the Dragon Ball license in the US. It was around this time that Bandai Namco was able to fully acquire the license and now freely publish Dragon Ball games both in Japan and the US, and that's how that partnership came to an end. As for the game, Raging Blast, it was a step down from Burst Limit. Sure, there was something there for fans who preferred Tenkaichi over Budokai, there were more characters, more abilities, but as usual, it all came at the cost of game mechanics, which were fully recycled from the PlayStation 2 games, and some didn't transition very well. The camera had loads of issues, you spent half the time spinning that left thumbstick trying to get up. Also, if Burst Limit had an awesome cinematic feel to it when you were watching cutscenes in the middle of a fight, Raging Blast was incredibly rough. And Raging Blast 2, which came out the following year, didn't do much to improve. Some of the gameplay was polished, but they completely gave up on storytelling by giving you a series of fights for each character instead of a story mode. The fan service was certainly there, with dialogue between specific characters, a ton of characters to select from, lots of transformations and fusions and all of that, but it wasn't enough to conceal how shallow the rest of the game was. The world had moved past Tenkaichi. This was no longer enough. So Spike tried something else, Ultimate Tenkaichi. Welcome to Cutscenes, the video game. The combat system was completely different, but you watch the game more than you play it. You initiate a combo and then choose which button you want to press for a follow-up. And if the opponent guesses the same as you, he blocks it and you have to start over. Everything had a minigame, throwing supers, key blasts, countering opponents. And the idea wasn't inherently bad, it made for a more casual game, but it all relied on luck a bit too much. You just had to guess which button the opponent was gonna press in order to avoid it. There was no other way of doing it. But the game did do something right. It gave players the option of creating a character. For the first time in the Western market, players could create their own Dragon Ball avatar. It wasn't the first game to do this overall, Dragon Ball Online did it first, but that stayed in Asia, so this was new to a lot of people. And even though the options were limited, players were excited to make their own character, to customize their own abilities and play through an original story where they were the stars of the show. Spike's next game would happen a year later after they fused with Chunsoft, and from that fusion came Dragon Ball Z for Kinect, the only Dragon Ball game exclusive to the Xbox 360. So take our previous game, Ultimate Tenkaichi, with its long cutscenes in the middle of a battle, constantly stopping the action in favor of cinematics, and make the game first person with motion controls using the Kinect. That's the kind of game we have here. The game was obviously very poorly received as it was repetitive, the motion controls were bad, and Spike Chunsoft, after dragging Tenkaichi through the mud during this generation, and then coming up with this game for the Kinect, they never developed another Dragon Ball game again. Coincidence? Who knows? Finally, before we close this generation, a new developer tried their hand at a Dragon Ball game with Battle of Z by Artink. This was their first and their last Dragon Ball game, and it was a very different type of game. An arena brawler where you would fly around the field and sometimes fight multiple enemies at the same time. It led up to 8 players fight at any given point, with a team of 4 players who could share their energy and heal each other, as well as sync up and perform cooperative attacks. The game was awkward and repetitive to play in general, but it focused on online team play, cooperative and competitive. And despite the mixed reception, it wouldn't be the last time that we would see this concept in a Dragon Ball game. We jump forward in time. Another generation of consoles goes by, not just the home consoles but the handheld as well. Welcome to the 3DS era. In the West, the 3DS is mostly known for two Dragon Ball games, Extreme Butoden and Fusions. Extreme Butoden came out first, developed by a Bandai Namco studio, with graphics and general art done by Arc System Works, who had worked with them previously on Supersonic Warriors. Arc Systems was well established as a fighting game developer at this point, being successful with their Guilty Gear and Blaze Blue series. And that's exactly what they came here to do in the 3DS. They came to work on a traditional fighting game. Sure, they only worked on the visuals, but that's part of what was so good about their games. They had really impressive visuals in addition to a cool fighting system in place. So Extreme Butoden is still to this day heavily associated with Arc System Works, despite most of the work having been done by an inside studio at Bandai Namco. Fusions, on the other hand, was more of an RPG. You could create your own character, free roam the world, do some exploration, and then you had this semi-active battle system that was actually quite interesting. It tells an original story in a different dimension, and just like you would expect from the title, it featured a lot of fusions. Fusions from the anime, fusions from the manga, and also new original fusions. It even had a 5-way fusion mechanic invented by the Ginyu Force that the player could perform as well at some point in the game. So you would be able to fuse with 4 other characters for something called an Ultra Fusion, and that was an exciting concept. But in Japan, there was another series that was actually more popular. The Data Carddass games were finally leaving the arcades with their latest game, Dragon Ball Heroes. They brought the series over to the 3DS. First up was Dragon Ball Heroes Ultimate Mission. The arcade game was recreated in the 3DS. Players would use decks of virtual cards for battles. With the bottom screen, you would arrange and play the game, while the top screen displayed attack animations. The game featured almost 1,000 virtual cards, which is basically different characters or different versions of the same characters, stuff like that. And of course, the big feature that drew people in was still present. The original story, the original animation, with original characters, as well as alternate versions for the characters that we know and love. Ultimate Mission 2 improved the graphics and the amount of content, with more than 2,000 cards available, more than doubling the amount of the previous game. And then Ultimate Mission X did precisely the same, improved graphics once again, and included more than 3,000 cards. And Ultimate Mission X seems lined up to be the last Dragon Ball game for the 3DS. By the time this game came out, Nintendo had already launched the Switch a month prior, and everything seems to point that that's where Dragon Ball games are going to live in the future. But nevertheless, this series that started as a trading card game on the arcades is now closing Nintendo's popular handheld console, and we might not have seen the end of it yet. Speaking of arcades, I remember saying we closed that chapter. And having closed the book on the PSP, Nintendo DS, and the Wii, it's time to wrap up another platform, the arcades. Well, technically Zenkai Battle was sort of re-released in 2015, and that really was the last game on arcades so far. But in 2014, there was another one, Dragon Ball Discross. And I'm not even gonna talk about this one for too long because it's just a bad game. You buy discs, you put the discs in the machine, and then you tap the button as fast as you can, and then the game decides whether you win or lose. Let's just move on. This was also the time when mobile games were booming, and Bandai wasn't gonna let that market go without some Dragon Ball games. They went in pretty heavy on this. It all started with Dragon Ball Tap Battle, a real-time fighting game where you would tap the screen to move, charge, attack, pretty much everything. You could even play multiplayer if you were close to someone else who won the game. Then came Dragon Ball RPG Shonen Hen, which, judging from the title, you might have guessed, yes, it's an RPG. A very traditional RPG actually, something not very common in mobile games. It was pretty similar to Attack of the Saiyans, the game developed by Monolith for the Nintendo DS. Dragon Ball Ultimate Swipe brought back the real-time action combat, but this time from a first-person perspective, and it gave me weird Dragon Ball Kinect flashbacks. But it wouldn't be until 2015 that Bandai would hit absolute gold with a mobile game. They did it with Dragon Ball Z Dokkan Battle. The game is still updated, still popular, still played to this day. 3 years after release, not many games can claim that. In this game, you assemble your own custom team of characters using cards, a system very similar to Dragon Ball Heroes, and that's really the big appeal. Unlocking new characters, leveling them up, making your dream team, because the battles themselves are popping bubbles. It doesn't look very exciting. I agree, it's not very exciting, but there is some strategy to it, even if it's not a very Dragon Ball-like system. Then we had Dragon and the Incredible Adventures on iOS, known as Kamehameha on Android. This game is a mystery to me. There's barely any advertising for the game. I had never heard of it until I made this video. I'm not even sure if it's an official Bandai Namco game, but it seems to have come out in 2017. It's a turn-based battle game with over 200 characters that you can pick and make your own team, similar to Dokkan Battle in that way, and it also seems to have updates and events happening regularly. But it has a very different fighting system. It's got this turn-based thing like I mentioned. And finally, let's talk about Dragon Ball Legends. The game brings mobile Dragon Ball games back to action fighting, this time with a behind-the-back camera. You still have a card system where you unlock abilities and new characters, so it retains that successful mechanic from Dokkan Battle, but promises a more exciting fighting system. Not only can you play through story mode, you can also play PvP against other players, online, anywhere on the globe, and in real time. At the time of making this video, the game has not been released yet, but already has over 2 million players wanting to participate in beta tests. So you can already tell, it's gonna be huge. It might even be the biggest Dragon Ball mobile game to date. On the home console side of things, coming from a largely disappointing generation, we transition to a much more exciting one, with new concepts for Dragon Ball games, or at least evolutions of previous concepts done in a very meaningful way. Dragon Ball Xenoverse was the transitional title. After Battle of Z, Xenoverse actually used a similar but more polished combat system. It came out for the previous generation and the current generation of consoles simultaneously, and it was also the first Dragon Ball game coming out on the PC, if you don't count Dragon Ball Online, which, let's be real, not a lot of people count Dragon Ball Online. And despite it being the third Dragon Ball game featuring character creation, it was the first one to do so by giving players a large amount of options, so in many ways, it still feels like the first game to actually pull it off. Dragon Ball Xenoverse was incredibly significant in the history of Dragon Ball games. It had its flaws, for sure, repetitive missions, lag in team battles, but character creation paired up with being able to play online with your friends, and a whole new community of players being able to enjoy a Dragon Ball game on their PCs, launched Xenoverse to new heights. It became one of the best-selling Dragon Ball games of all time, right up there alongside the first Budokai, which, funny enough, was another game developed by Dimps. So Dimps is pretty much confirmed to be the best seller when it comes to Dragon Ball games. Obviously, they had to make a sequel, and it came out fast. Only a year and a half later, Xenoverse 2 was out. The game was heavily criticized for being very similar to the previous game, but as time went by, the community gained a different appreciation for it. Xenoverse 2 was bigger than the first Xenoverse. It made a lot of quality of life adjustments. It added abilities, transformations, outfits. It even came out later on the Nintendo Switch. But more importantly, it was built to be supported over time. Regular updates, regular events, regular DLC, the game was built to last way more than a year. So as the people who only saw it as the copy of the first Xenoverse stopped playing and left the game, it continued to thrive with the community who stuck with it. There are rumors of a Xenoverse 3 already in development, but for now, Xenoverse 2 is still generally loved by Dragon Ball fans. What came after Xenoverse 2 was actually a completely different breed of game. After working on the visuals of Supersonic Warriors 2 and Extreme Butoden, Bandai Namco finally gave Arc System Works permission to fully develop a game. Coming from their anime fighting games background, they took that formula that had found success within the fighting games community and gave it a Dragon Ball coating. The result was Dragon Ball FighterZ. At first glance, this game is the best of both worlds. Great fighting game mechanics from a veteran developer, merged with beautiful Dragon Ball graphics and over-the-top animation. But the community was actually very split on this title. Fighting game fans loved it, of course, but a lot of Dragon Ball fans struggled to understand the appeal. For a fighting game fan, the quality of the game is extremely obvious, but for a casual Dragon Ball fan, this was a backward step. Story mode wasn't that exciting, it was lacking in content. We went from 3D games to a 2.5D, from hundreds of characters to a roster just over 20 characters. So just like Xenoverse, FighterZ ended up finding its own community. Those who disliked it dropped it, and those who liked it stuck with it. As the game continues to receive updates with new features, new characters, and continues to grow within the fighting games community, as it claims the #1 spot on EVO 2018 with the highest number of signups for the tournament. So where do we go from here? The mobile games market continues to be huge, so surely we haven't seen the last Dragon Ball game on that platform, even after Dragon Ball Legends. And as far as home consoles go, I believe that every year we'll see less and less Dragon Ball games. Not because the games are not popular or anything, but because games themselves have evolved to work as a service nowadays, to be supported for a long time after release. We've already seen that happen with Xenoverse, and we're seeing that happen with FighterZ right now. I'm sure these are not the last Dragon Ball games this generation has seen, but the times of 5 Dragon Ball games per year are now far behind us. Whatever the future holds, I believe the series will continue to have its ups and downs, and we'll be here to let them know when we dislike something. But for us living in the present, I'd say it's a pretty damn good time to be a fan of Dragon Ball games.